everybody, it's Mrs. Clemens and Mr. Marshall. It's not really Mr. Marshall, he's not with me right now, but it's still U.S. History Flipped. Woo-woo! Alright, so this is the last bit of stuff talking about Reconstruction. We're going to talk about the effects, the economic, political, and social impacts of the Reconstruction. So, particularly in the South. So we're going to talk about the South after Reconstruction. All right, so our political changes that we're talking about, first off, it was called the Solid South, meaning that basically you could count on the South to vote Democratic. Were there some Republicans? Yes, but for the most part, wildly Democratic, and it actually stayed like that for quite a long time. Into the mid-1900s. Now, of course, now you look at the South and it's pretty solidly Republican, and we're going to talk about in class how there's a whole switch with that. Definitely one of the major results of all this is, yes, the national government is supreme. That whole back and forth with federalism as to, you know, who's going to hold the power. Is it going to be the states? Is it going to be the national government? How is it shared? Yeah, you can share it, but overall the national government is supreme. We're not going to have another war. And African Americans became disenfranchised. And disenfranchised is a really important term for you to know. Basically means that you're getting your democracy taken away. You're getting your power to vote taken away. So like when you guys turn 18, you become enfranchised. You now have that democratic power to influence our government. These guys are becoming disenfranchised, and this is following the 15th Amendment, which gave the right to vote to all males in the United States. And the ways that they become disenfranchised is the literacy test, where you had to pass a reading test to be able to vote. Remember, it was very unfair. The poll tax, where you had to pay to vote. And remember, both of these, you know, we've talked about the literacy test and the poll tax around until the 1960s, the mid-1960s. And then you have the grandfather clause, where you couldn't vote unless your grandfather could vote. That one went away a little bit sooner, but still, all three of these things are disenfranchising African Americans following Reconstruction. Economic changes, you know, prior to the war, you have the majority of people that are these large landowners. Well, actually, they're all white, but they're very, very wealthy. Most of the people have, you know, the wealthy people have huge farms. The majority of the South, though, was poor, you know, like how it generally is in society, that, you know, you have a few rich and most people are not in that economic strata. So those guys, their plantations get split up, but they're sold to other whites. Now, what ends up happening is some other whites in the South become tenant farmers, where they're renting their land. They have to provide all their own supplies, you know, in terms of seed and tools and, you know, pack animals, stuff like that. The blacks became sharecroppers, and this again also lasted into the 20th century, where you instead of paying rent, you're paying a share of the crop that you harvest to your landlord, but you're still, you know, responsible for you know, your own housing and clothing and stuff like that. But the problem is, when at some point you have a drought or something, well, you still have to pay the crop. So either you have to choose, do I pay the crop and not eat, or do I go into debt with the landlord? And what they did was they went into debt, and they got to the point that you just couldn't get out of it, and then just constantly, well, the next year they owe even more of the crop. You know, the year after that they owe even more and more. And so it almost became another form of slavery, where there was just no way to get out. Because kids ask me a lot, like, well, why didn't they just leave? Why didn't they just go to the North? Well, the only thing they knew was that area. The only thing they knew how to do was to work on plantations. They do this, and they get to the point that they just can't leave. Social changes, and we're going to talk about Jim Crow laws. So this is for a restaurant. It says we serve colored carry out only, so they couldn't come in to eat at the restaurant. They could get stuff to go. This is a public swimming pool. I like that it's public, but only for white people. And these are examples of Jim Crow laws. And again, up here you see this is a bus. It says white patrons, please seat from front. Colored patrons, please seat from rear. This is a colored waiting room. I'm not sure if it's a theater, something along those lines. So yeah, you have Jim Crow laws where you're going to have legal segregation of public facilities. And this also continued, that it was the law to separate people based on race until the mid-1960s. So obviously we're going to be coming back to this quite a bit, particularly when we do the Civil Rights era. So now we have the Supreme Court, and they need to weigh in on this. And remember, we talked about how there's some of those really negative cases throughout history, and this is one of them. So so we have Plessy versus Ferguson, where Mr. Plessy wanted to ride. He paid to ride on a train, you know, to have the good seats, which just so happened, of course, to be in the white section. And, you know, he was told he needed to move to sit in the colored section. And so he sued. It goes up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says, you know what? Segregation is awesome. It's totally great. Totally works, as long as they're equal, as long as the facilities are equal. So you can have separate schools, you can have separate trains, buses, bathrooms, restaurants, you know, water fountains, as long as they're equal. And this is one of those things where obviously they were not equal. No matter what, they can't be equal. When you separate people like that, it just, you just can't be equal. And so, you know, this is 1896. This stands until 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education. So just like you needed to do the 13th and 14th Amendment to reverse the Dred Scott decision, you need to do the same thing. You had to either have another case or you need to have amendments. So Plessy is there, like I said, until 1954. They start to strike down some of that. Some of the responses to segregation, we've got two important folks that are around the turn of the century into the 1900s. We have Booker T. Washington, and the way I always remember him, the T stands for training, and he was from the South, and he has a different perspective. You know, he says it's going to be very difficult for blacks and whites to be socially equal. So he thinks that they have an option or an ability, a potential to be equal economically. And he says that you need to have vocational training. And so vocational training is sort of like what we have at our BOCES, you know, where you might be trained to be a mechanic or a plumber or you know, air conditioning, cosmetology, some of those different things where you have an actual skill. So like in high school, though I love high school, we don't actually get a skill. The only skill we're preparing you for is college. So so he says vocational training, that will give people their own self-respect, and that they'll, you know, be able to at least provide for themselves. Now, W.B. Du Bois, he has a different viewpoint. He says that's a bunch of hooey. Part of the reason why he differs from Booker T. Washington is because he's from the North. He attends Harvard. He and some of his associates, they end up forming the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And he says, listen, there's no reason why blacks and whites can't be completely equal in every single way. And so he is an advocate for total equality, you know, not just economic equality. And so he is sort of what I like to think of, and historians like to think of, as a forerunner to Martin Luther King, you know, who has that same idea that no matter what, that blacks and whites should be equal in every way, shape, or form. All right, guys, thanks for listening.